Hi students, welcome to Easy Elimu Learning Simplified. My name is Mbithe, and in today's session, we are going to learn about relative clauses. We will do a recap of what clauses are, and then we will go into what relative clauses are. We will define what a relative clause is, and we will also attempt to identify or pick out a relative clause in a sentence. So remember when we learned about compound sentences and complex sentences, we learned what a clause is. Remember we said that a clause is a group of words that form either a complete sentence or a part of a sentence. We said a clause includes a subject and a verb. And then we also said that there are two types of clauses, that is the independent clause or the main clause, and the subordinate clause, also known as the dependent clause. We also said that an independent clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb and can stand alone and make sense on its own. So it can form a sentence on its own because it makes complete sense when it is on its own. We also said that a subordinate clause is a group of words that also contains a subject and a verb and a subordinating conjunction. And we said that a subordinate clause cannot make sense on its own. It cannot make grammatical sense on its own. It cannot express a complete thought on its own. So it requires the main clause. So we can have a look at two examples of sentences and attempt to distinguish which is the main clause and which is the subordinate clause. The teacher gave me a novel and I read it from cover to cover. The teacher gave me a novel and I read it from cover to cover. The main clause in that sentence is the teacher gave me a novel. That is the independent clause. It can make sense on its own. That is a complete sentence on its own. And then, and I read it from cover to cover is the subordinate clause. It was my brother's birthday yesterday, but he did not want to throw a party. The independent clause in that sentence is, it was my brother's birthday yesterday. And the subordinate clause is, but he did not want to throw a party. So I hope you now remember what a clause is and you're able to identify a clause in a sentence. Let us now move to relative clauses, which is our topic for today. So a relative clause will enable us to identify a person or a thing that is being talked about. It is a clause that enables us to identify a person or a thing that is being talked about. And relative clauses are introduced by relative pronouns, pronouns such as who, whom, that, whose, and which. So we can start by talking about who and whom. So these two relative pronouns introduce relative clauses that talk about people. If a relative clause is talking about people, it will be introduced by either who or whom. For example, I met a lot of people who work for the organization. The man who talked to you is my father. So as you can see in those sentences, they are introducing a relative clause that is talking about people. Now, for the relative pronoun whom, it is only used after a preposition. It comes after a preposition. For example, where is the student for whom I paid school fees? In that sentence, our preposition is for, and then we have the relative pronoun whom that introduces the relative clause I paid I paid school fees. So where is the student for whom I paid school fees? For is the preposition, and then whom comes immediately after and introduces the relative clause. Let us now proceed to the relative pronouns that and whose. These two pronouns introduce relative clauses that talk about people, animals, or things. Remember, we have said that who and whom only introduce relative clauses that talk about people only. But that and whose introduce relative clauses that talk about people, clauses that talk about animals, and clauses that talk about things. For example, the man that I talked to is the guest of honor. The man that I talked to is the guest of honor. The cat that chased the rat is hiding. So in the first sentence, it has introduced a relative clause that is talking about a person. In the second sentence, that has introduced a relative clause that is talking about an animal. The shirt whose pocket was ripped off is here. And the third sentence, the third has introduced a relative clause that is talking about a thing. So you can see that can be used in different ways, can be used to introduce people, animals, or things. The teacher whose school won in the football tournament was congratulated. Lastly, we are going to talk about the relative pronoun which. This relative pronoun is used to introduce relative clauses that talk about things only. It cannot introduce people or animals, only things. For example, the tree which was cut down has sprouted again. The poem which won in the contest was mine. So you can see it is introducing things. You can't use it to introduce a relative pronoun, a relative clause that is talking about people. You can't say the person which I talked to is here. No, it is only used to introduce things. Now, it is important to note that sometimes we can use that instead of who. We have said the pronoun who introduces clauses that talk about people only. And then we said the pronoun that introduces a relative clause that talks about people, animals, or things. So sometimes you can use that instead of who. For example, the detectives interrogated the man who was at the scene of crime. That first sentence we have used who. And then in the second sentence, the detectives interrogated the man that was at the scene of crime. In the second sentence, we have used that instead of who, and it is still correct. So you can take note of that. You can use that instead of who. So that's it for relative clauses. I hope you have understood and you're now able, if you're given a sentence, you're able to pick out the relative clause. You're able to also pick out the different relative pronouns that introduce the relative clauses. You know which relative pronoun to use where. So for further practice, you can have a look at the quiz. Complete the sentences below using either of the following relative pronouns: which, who, when, where, whose, or that. So I can do one, then you will do the rest. Do you have a novel dash I can borrow? So what is a novel? Is it a thing? Is it a person? Is it an animal? That is the first thing you ask yourself, so that you can know which pronoun to use. So you can say, do you have a novel? that I can borrow? Do you have a novel that I can borrow? Have a look at the rest and attempt to complete those sentences. Thank you for tuning in and see you in the next session.